Today, we're diving into one of the most shocking and important stories in the history of workers' rights. It's a story about glamour, cutting-edge science, unbelievable suffering, and in the end, a legacy that actually protects millions of us to this very day. So let's open the file on America's shining women and uncover the dark story of the Radium Girls.
You know, to really get the visceral horror of this story, you just have to see how people react to it now. This comment from a reader, it just says it all, doesn't it? It's this gut reaction that points to the central, horrifying question. Why on earth would anyone repeatedly put something so dangerous in their mouth? Well, the answer to that is the real core of this tragedy. So, picture this. It's the 1910s and 20s, and these young women were like celebrities in their factory towns. After their shifts, they'd go out to dance halls, and under the dim lights, they would actually shimmer. The radium dust they worked with all day just clung to them, creating this ethereal, ghostly glow. At the time, it seemed completely magical, but that magic was hiding a truly deadly secret. And this was the secret: radium jaw. A disease so horrific it sounds like something straight out of a nightmare. The women's jaws would literally rot and crumble away. They suffered from bones that would just break without any warning, and cancers that consumed them from the inside out. So how did a job that made them shine lead to a condition this gruesome? To get that answer, we've got to go back to the beginning, to who these women were, and the glamorous job that promised them such a brilliant, shining future. You really have to put yourself in their shoes. For a young woman in the 1910s, this was an absolute dream job. The pay was incredible, way more than they could earn almost anywhere else. They felt like they were doing their part for the war effort, painting watch dials for soldiers, and they got to work with this amazing, futuristic new element, radium. The factories basically became these social hubs, where they'd bring in their sisters and their friends to share in the good fortune. But here's the wild part. Nobody was afraid of this glowing paint. In fact, it was the exact opposite. And to understand why, you have to picture the world they were living in, a world that was gripped by a full-blown radium craze. After it was discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie, radium was seen as this miracle of modern science. It was the future. This glowing element wasn't just for watch dials. It was marketed as a source of health, of energy, of beauty. It was literally a fountain of youth that you could buy right over the counter. And when I say it was everywhere, I mean it was everywhere. You could get face creams for a radiant complexion, toothpaste for a brighter smile. You could buy water tonics that were charged with radium for vitality. So in their minds, they weren't handling some kind of poison. They were working with a health supplement. Some of the girls would even playfully paint their teeth with it before a date for a glowing smile. So, if radium was everywhere, why did it affect the dial painters so brutally? Well, the answer lies in a very specific technique they were taught. It was a simple shortcut designed for speed and profit, and it became a death sentence. It was called lip pointing. To get a perfectly fine tip on their brushes for those tiny numbers on the watch face, their supervisors told them to use their mouths. So it was this constant rhythm: lip, dip, paint. They were ingesting a small amount of radium paint with every single stroke. And since they were paid by the dial, the faster they worked, the more they earned. They were literally being paid to poison themselves hundreds of times every single day. And here is the heart of the betrayal. The companies told the women the paint was totally safe, maybe even healthy. But the executives, the scientists, they knew better. While the girls were licking the brushes, the men who were handling radium in bulk were using lead shields and metal tongs. The dangers were already known in scientific circles, but that information was deliberately kept from the women on the factory floor. And then, within a few years, the women started getting sick. It began with things that seemed, well, ordinary. A toothache that just wouldn't go away. Teeth that became loose and fell out. Sores in their mouths that wouldn't heal. Dentists had no idea what was going on. The story of Molly Maggia is just one of the most tragic examples. She went to the dentist for a tooth extraction, but the wound never healed. Then more teeth came out. Then, in a follow-up appointment, her dentist barely touched her jaw and the bone just broke apart in his hand. You see, the radium, which the body mistakes for calcium, had settled into her bones and was literally eating them away from the inside. As more and more women fell ill and died in these horrible ways, a few brave souls decided to fight back. And this led to a landmark legal battle that was truly David versus Goliath, dying young women against a powerful, wealthy corporation. Grace Fryer was one of the first to connect these mysterious illnesses back to her old job. But for 2 years, no lawyer would even take their case. The U.S. Radium Corporation was just too powerful. By the time they finally found an attorney willing to represent them, the women were so weak and their bones so brittle that not a single one of them could physically raise her arm to be sworn in. They had to be helped. The company's legal strategy was just brutal. First, delay, delay, delay. They were hoping the women who the press started calling the living dead would just die before a verdict could be reached. Next, they tried to get the case thrown out on technicality. Then, they smeared the women's names, hiring doctors to claim they all had syphilis. And maybe worst of all, they buried their own internal report that proved the radium was what was killing them. The whole case seemed impossible. It was their word against this huge corporation. They needed a smoking gun, some kind of undeniable proof. And that proof came from a surprisingly simple scientific instrument, the gold leaf electroscope. Just think of it as a basic radiation detector. If radiation is present, a tiny charged piece of gold leaf inside will physically move. A physicist named Elizabeth Hughes, who had actually worked for both the National Bureau of Standards and the Radium Company, was hired by the women's lawyer. She had the women breathe into the electroscope, and the result? It was immediate. It was undeniable. The gold leaf moved, proving that their very breath was radioactive. They were so saturated with radium that their bodies were constantly emitting radon gas. This was the smoking gun. Faced with this undeniable proof and growing public outrage, the company finally settled. The number you see on your screen, $10,000, is what each woman received. It was a huge sum at the time, plus they got a pension and all their medical bills paid. But let's be honest, it was small compensation for a life cut short in such a horrific way. And tragically, all 5 of the women who started that lawsuit died within just a few years of the settlement. But their fight was not in vain. The story doesn't end with their deaths. It ends with the legacy of protection that was born from their incredible courage, a legacy that affects all of us. Their case sent shockwaves across the country. Because of their fight, new laws were passed to protect workers from industrial poisons. A decade later, when scientists on the Manhattan Project were handling radioactive material, it was the memory of the Radium girls that shaped their safety standards. Their battle was a key step in a long journey that would eventually lead to the creation of OSHA, the very agency that protects millions of American workers today. What their fight really established was something revolutionary at the time: the right for a worker to sue their employer over unsafe conditions. This fundamentally shifted the balance of power, forcing companies to be responsible for their employees' health. The protections so many of us take for granted at our jobs today were truly built on the bones of these women. Just remember, these women were told their job was safe, that they were working with a miracle product. It really makes you think, doesn't it? As our own technology evolves, what are the hidden dangers we might be overlooking right now? What will be the cautionary tale for the next generation?